p.m. on October the 11th. My name is John Mursky. I'm chair of the Ann Arbor Energy Commission. As chair, I'm calling this meeting together. I am participating from my home here in Ann Arbor. Welcome to this electronic meeting of the committee, or commission, I should say. This virtual meeting is to affect social distancing and to mitigate the spread of the COVID-19 virus. We will conduct this meeting similar to in-person's meeting. At the end of the meeting, I'll raise the topic of when we start to meet in person, because I think the city of Ann Arbor has adjusted some of its policies now. So we'll come to that later on. In any case, commissioners, during the roll call, please indicate your current location. During the meeting, please remain on camera just as you would be visible during in-person meetings. Also, mute your microphone if you are not speaking. Public comment will be via telephone only. To speak during any of the two public comment options or opportunities, please call one of the following toll-free numbers: 877-853-5247 or 888-788-0099 and enter the meeting ID 956-8718-7876 on your phone. This information is also available on the published agenda and the public need notices section of the city website, and on the broadcast of this meeting on CTN channel 16, AT&T channel 99, and online at www.a2gov.org or a2gov.org, yes, /watch TV or watch CTN. Joe, I'm going to have you read the land acknowledgement, and then we'll take the roll call, and I'll have you introduce yourself. And we have several new commissioners, and we'll all go around and introduce ourselves very briefly. How's that?
Sounds good. Thanks. We acknowledge that the land the city of Ann Arbor occupies is the ancestral, traditional, and contemporary lands of the Anishinaabe and Wyandot peoples. We further acknowledge that our city stands, like almost all property in the United States, on lands obtained generally in unconscionable ways from indigenous peoples. The taking of this land was formalized by the Treaty of Detroit in 1807. Knowing where we live, work, study, and recreate does not change the past, but a thorough understanding of the ongoing consequences of this past can empower us in our work to create a future that supports human flourishing and justice for all individuals.
Thank you very much. So let's do the roll call, and then after that, we'll go from my screen, and I'll just have everybody introduce themselves. The new commissioners can speak a little bit longer because most of the rest of us know each other a little bit better in the meantime. So Joe, go ahead and do the roll call, and then I'll start with you and then go around the screen.
All right. Chair Mursky.
Present. In calling or dialing in from my home in Ann Arbor.
Vice Chair Colvin Garcia.
Present from Ann Arbor.
All right. Bridget Maycomer. I think she's just joining there.
Have you let her in yet?
Yeah, they're right there. We're doing roll call. Commissioner Maycomer.
Yeah, thanks. I'm joining from a residence in Arcadia, Michigan.
Thank you. Commissioner Levin.
Yes, I'm here. Unfortunately, I'm having some technical issues with my main computer, and this backup does not have the video capabilities, but I am here in Ann Arbor.
Councilmember Briggs.
Here in Ann Arbor.
Councilmember Radina.
Here in Ann Arbor.
Commissioner McCoy. Commissioner Kerber.
Here in Ann Arbor.
Commissioner Overpeck.
Present in Ann Arbor.
Commissioner Smith.
here in Ann Arbor.
Commissioner Cohen.
Here
Sorry.
in Ann Arbor. All good.
Commissioner Zittelman, not present. Commissioner McKenna,
Present in Ann Arbor.
Commissioner Harp,
Here in Ann Arbor.
and Commissioner Berkowitz.
Here in Ann Arbor.
We have a quorum, I think. Thank you very much. By the way, Alex and Missy both have conflicts tonight. They both indicated that in advance, and so they are excused, so to speak. Thanks for the rest of you for being here. Joe, I'm going to have you introduce yourself because I'm not sure all the commission members know you, and then go around. I'll go after that, and we'll go around the screen then.
Sure, thanks. Hi all, to those I haven't met, I'm Joe Lang. I am a energy coordinator here with the Office of Sustainability and Innovations. Started back in June, so still fully getting acclimated and getting to know everyone. But I'm primarily working on a lot of our residential decarbonization work with Zach and a few others. I most recently came from Indiana University, where I had a dual master's in environmental science and public affairs while working at the Environmental Resilience Institute, which does a lot of work with local governments in Indiana on climate change.
Great. Glad to have you with us, Joe. So I'm John Mursky. For those of you who don't know me, I obviously chair the commission. I've been on the commission since late, I think, 2016. I also serve as the liaison to the Environmental Commission. I'm originally from Ann Arbor, but lived away for almost 40 years. I had a career in industry with the German conglomerate Bosch, and it's great to work together with all of you. Larry.
I'm Larry Kerber. I've been in Ann Arbor most of my working life, and I am doing commercial solar development here in Washtenaw County.
Thea, do you want to introduce yourself? You can do it now and then skip it later.
Yeah, hi, good evening, commissioners. My name is Thea Yeager-Leonard. I am an energy analyst in the Office of Sustainability with Joe and Zach. I prepare a greenhouse gas inventory, work on a lot of metrics in our office, and also work on improving the efficiency of commercial buildings around Ann Arbor.
Kendall.
I'm Kendall. I am a junior at the University of Michigan, and I'm originally from Chicago, so I've only been here a few years. I have a part-time job as an environmental specialist, and this is my second call on the commission.
And Claire. Claire is new for the first time today, I think.
Hey everyone, so happy to be joining you. I'm also fairly new to Ann Arbor. This is my second year of doctoral studies at SEAS, so I have some colleagues on. Great to see them. I guess I'll just share a little bit about my background while we're going around. I had an 11-year career in industry, starting in behind the meter solar. So started as a solar electrical designer, engineer, and then for about 6 or 7 years practiced in an MEP, so mechanical, electrical, plumbing, building design. I was at the end of my time there in Boston, the head of sustainable design for WSP. It's a fairly large engineering firm, and actually internationally. So really specialize in high performance buildings. I would say my area of expertise is buildings and electrification most recently. And my final role before coming to doctoral studies was at RMI, where I actually helped cities a lot like Ann Arbor, but mostly focused in New England on electrification policies and natural gas bans.
Gabriel, I think you go by Gabe, right?
It's Gabe or Gabriel. Either way, it's just fine with me.
Okay, go ahead.
Hi everyone. My name's Gabriel Harp. Let's see what to tell you about myself. Shout out to SPIA and Indiana University. I went to Indiana University as well, and studied biology a while ago. I came to the University of Michigan later and studied the arts and design. But originally I'm from Detroit, and I've sort of moved all across the world. I think I've spent some time in South India working on with working on issues of energy, primarily around simulation and gaming to help understand trade-offs associated with choices that are made and the intersection of energy, public policy, and social science. And I've also worked thinking particularly about futures and different technology futures from different perspectives, primarily as a way to engage others. I've also led public opinion research, national public opinion research around climate change with a group called Eco America, which has sort of helped shift the balance of public opinion around climate change and understand people's affordances, questions, mental models around energy and different questions that we're facing. And here I work for the University of Michigan as the director for research and creative practice development at the Taubman College of Architecture and Urban Planning.
Mike Berkowitz.
Hello, everyone. Good to be joining you. This is my first meeting as a commissioner. I was just recently appointed. I use he, him pronouns. Also, while I'm on it, thank you to Mayor Taylor, the City Council for appointing me, and to Missy Soltz. I know she's not here today, but I appreciate all of that. And really, it's an honor to be appointed. I'm excited to listen, learn, and nerd out with all of you. A little bit about me. I'm an A20 ambassador. I live in Ward 5. I see Erica Briggs on here. Shout out, and thanks for your representation and service to our ward. I'm on the Old West Side, right behind Slauson Middle School. They actually just had a soccer game that let out, so I can kind of watch it from our backyard. It's lovely. And I live here with my significant other and our beagle dog. I'm a Spartan, but I root for University of Michigan when they're not playing us, so please don't hold it against me too much. You can often find me at the Ann Arbor Ice Cube. I play on a handful of mediocre hockey teams. I love to explore West Park and Eberwhite, take my dogs on walks over there. And you can also find me, I'm in the Mug Club at Wolverine State Brewing Company and Blue Tractor. So if you ever want to talk about energy policy over a craft beer, open invitation to anybody. My day job is actually, I lead the Sierra Club's Beyond Coal campaign in Michigan. We do energy policy, largely focused on holding DTE and consumers' energy accountable, often through the Public Service Commission and through the courts. So excited to be joining, and thanks for the time.
Councilmember Briggs.
Yes, so I'm the Ward 5 representative and have been serving on the City Council since 2020. I also live pretty close to Slauson Middle School, just on the other side of Huron. I'm Mark Hanna and have lived in Ann Arbor for a little over 20 years. I'm here with my dog and 2 cats and 2 boys, though one is off and has graduated from college and the other one's at Pioneer. Have a background in transportation and land use policy, most recently running an organization called Scenic Michigan. And I am just really excited to be serving on City Council and on this, being a liaison to this commission with all of you amazing folks.
Vice Chair Calvin Garcia. Carlene, go ahead.
Sorry about that here. Hi, everyone. My name is Carlene Colvin Garcia. I'm the Vice Chair, Ann Arbor Energy Commission. I've been serving on the Energy Commission since 2017. And I am currently working on electric vehicle charging infrastructure, focusing on multi-unit dwellings. And I am apologizing here for
He's persistent.
Yeah. And which I will get back to. I have been in Ann Arbor since I graduated with my undergraduate degree here at the U of M, and have been actively participating in community advocacy endeavors and from safe routes to school, helping kids, traverse to and from school safely, walking, biking, to helping to get the first solar power installation at the Ann Arbor Public Schools. And when I'm not doing my work, you can find me hiking or running along the local trails here in Ann Arbor. And this weekend, my team and I are going to be competing in the Detroit Free Press Marathon Relay. And we're hoping to take first this year for our team. Took second last year, so we're really hoping to be successful this year. So thanks so much.
Thanks, Carlene. Sharish.
Hello all, my name is Sharice Smith, and I work with Guidehouse, a consulting firm, and primarily focused on supporting utility clients and kind of background across a number of topic areas, including energy efficiency of the built environment, renewables, kind of utility rates, as well as kind of most recently primarily focused on transportation electrification and supporting those utility-based programs to increase EV adoption and charger deployment. And I am from Ann Arbor and have spent most of my time here, and looking forward to working with you all.
Commissioner Peck.
Hi, I'm Jonathan Overpeck. I go by Peck. I use he, him pronouns, and I'm the Dean of the School for Environment and Sustainability at the University of Michigan and a climate scientist for my whole career. And I'm also on the Michigan Climate Solutions Council, the governor's council that is helping create a carbon neutrality in Michigan. Thank you.
Commissioner McCoy. Amber.
Hi, everyone. Nice to see some new faces and new familiar faces and familiar faces. My name's Ember. I use she, her pronouns. I'm a PhD candidate at the School for Environment and Sustainability. I study air pollution policy and politics, mostly around environmental justice issues, and have been doing diversity, equity, and inclusion work in the environmental space in various capacities for the past 10 or so years. I'm also originally from Chicago area, moved here for just 2 years, over 8 years ago, and I'm still going to be here for a little longer. Ann Arbor does that to you. And I'm also a member of the Mug Club at Wolverine, so that's a fun connection that I didn't expect to ever make in these meetings. So yeah, excited to be here.
Commissioner McComber.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to all the new members. I have been on the Energy Commission, I think, 6 years, something like that, but I lose track of time. I've served on the Ann Arbor Parks Commission in the past. I have been in Ann Arbor since the late 80s. I have a background in medical social work, but I have been working as a finance director for over 20 years for a local nonprofit, the Ecology Center. And I will leave it there.
Councilmember Radina.
Thanks. I'm Travis Radina, he, him pronouns. I have represented Ward 3 since 2020, and like Erica, have been here as a liaison to the Energy Commission for that entire time. I grew up in Frankenmuth, Michigan, but came to Ann Arbor for college. Spent a brief period up in Lansing working in the Michigan House of Representatives, where I actually met Mike, and have been back here in Ann Arbor for about 9 years. And so looking forward to working with all of the new members. As someone who has seen Mike play mediocre hockey and had a beer with him, anyone who wants to take him up on that, he is great company. So.
Zach, why don't you go next?
Sure. Hello, everyone. I've been before this body a couple of times before, but those who I haven't met, my name is Zach Wass-Smith. I use he, him pronouns. I am working in the Office of Sustainability, doing building decarbonization work primarily. My title is Community Engagement Specialist, so I do some work involving that as well.
And that leaves Noah.
Hello. I'm Noah Levin. I'm originally from the East Coast, New Jersey, I first came to Ann Arbor as a student in the late 90s. At the time it was SNRE, now C's. I also after that, got a law degree at Lewis and Clark in Portland, Oregon. And I've been back living in Ann Arbor for the past 15 years or so. And over the years, I've done work with regulating of utilities and other stationary sources related to air emissions. Currently live on the west side of Ann Arbor with my two kids who go to A2 STEAM. And welcome to all the new members.
So I can echo other people's comments that it is indeed an honor and a pleasure working with all of you. I'm really glad to see some of the new faces, bring some fresh new ideas and some diversity to the commission. And it's always almost astounding to me when I meet people in Ann Arbor, how accomplished they are, how interesting they are. And I'm looking forward to working with all of the new members of the commission. I think we have a great team. So thanks for all that. The next is the approval of the agenda. Can I get a motion and a second to approve the agenda? Moved by Commissioner Calvin Garcia and seconded by Councilmember Radina. Any comments or changes? Okay, all those in favor of approving the agenda, please raise your hand and say aye. Aye. Anyone opposed? It passes unanimously. Thank you. Next is approval of the minutes. The minutes are posted on Legistar. Can I get a motion to approve the minutes? Also from Commissioner Calvin Garcia, and a second from Councilmember Radina. Any comments or changes proposed for the minutes? Hearing none. All those in favor of approving the minutes, please raise your hand and say aye. Aye. Anyone opposed? Minutes are thus approved. Now we come to public input. This is an opportunity for members of the public to speak for up to 3 minutes. If you're watching on CTN, please call 888-788-0099 or 877-853-5247 and enter the meeting ID 956-8718-7876. This information is also displayed, as I said, on the meeting agenda and the video feed. City staff will select callers that have raised their hand one by one using the last 3 digits of your phone number. In order to electronically raise your hand to indicate your desire to speak, please press *9 on your phone, and then you will hear an automated message that the host is allowing you to speak. When speaking, please move to a quiet area and mute any background noises so that we may hear you clearly. Please state your name and your address at the beginning of your comments.
Don't currently have any hands raised.
Okay.
Now I do. All right. Caller ending in 134.
Thank you, Mr. Lang and Chair Mirsky. This is Ken Garber. I live at 28 Haverhill Court. Somewhat predictably, I'm calling again about the proposed village housing development. These are the 484 units off Duverin Road with another 100 plus units to come later. You'll remember that at your July meeting, you passed a resolution urging the Planning Commission and City Council to encourage all buildings at the village to be fully electric, no natural gas. Thank you for taking that action. It had some effect. The developer, Robertson Brothers, later agreed to electrify the 164 single-family homes. but the 320 apartments will still use gas. The Planning Commission approved the project last month, and it next goes to City Council. The developer, to its great credit, agreed to meet with citizens about electrification of the rental units. That meeting took place 2 weeks ago. Attending for the citizenry were Matt Grokoff, Doug Selby, Jan Culbertson, and Sarah Hammerschmidt, all of whom have professional experience designing or building low and zero emission buildings. Robertson Brothers' entire senior management team showed up, including the CEO. There was an amazingly frank discussion of the barriers to building electrification that this developer faces. They had no concerns about the technology. Higher renter utility bills are not a major issue right now because current gas prices put electric heat pumps at near parity. There was some worry about upfront costs and supply chain reliability. But the biggest issue for them by far was our local electric utility, DTE Energy. In Robertson Brothers' experience, simply hooking new projects up to the grid can take a long time. In one instance, they built 10 homes and then waited a year for DTE to give them electric. Just getting DTE's attention can be hard. And if more transmission capacity is needed, there is no predicting when DTE will get around to making the necessary upgrades. It's probably not surprising for a monopoly utility not to care, but it means that electrification poses a major business risk for the village project. It's not just the delays. DTE charges large fees for electric upgrades. In contrast, DTE gas hookups are fast and cheap.
30 seconds.
By the way, I've heard that the Ann Arbor School District has also had to delay heat pump hookups until DTE gets around to making circuit upgrades. From a climate point of view, it's still insane for the village to go with gas. Full electrification should be mandatory for all new construction, and this should be written into our city code. But DTE's dilatory behavior is a real problem. I don't have an obvious solution except for city staff to bring up electric capacity at the very start of the review process so developers can bring DTE in right away. Muni would solve the problem, but we're still a long way from that.
Caller, we're at time. Thank you. Seeing no other hands.
Okay, good. Normally I don't comment, but I'm going to comment in this case. There is a planning commission meeting tonight. And Mr. Garber, I would encourage you to call in to the planning commission and share the same observations with the planning commission. I'll remark at this time and also at the end of the meeting that we are hoping still to have a joint planning and energy commission meeting to talk about all of these issues related to electrification, related to energy efficient construction, and all the various aspects related to that and the opportunities that the city of Ann Arbor has from a policy perspective and carrots and sticks to be able to promote sustainable construction. So this is really a major concern. And for those of you who remember Commissioner Hookham, I corresponded with Commissioner Hookham on this very matter this afternoon, and he confirmed that this is a major issue that we have facing us in Ann Arbor, and it will be a major obstacle potentially to meeting our carbon neutrality targets. So we are now on to the main topics of our meeting, and the first is a presentation of the greenhouse gas inventory for calendar year 2021 by Thea. Thea, I'll let you take things from here.
Great. Can you all view my screen okay?
Yes.
Awesome. Well, thank you. I am just going to introduce myself again for anyone jumping ahead and recording perhaps. My name is Thea Jägerlener. I'm an energy analyst with the City of Ann Arbor's Office of Sustainability. And I prepared Ann Arbor's community-wide greenhouse gas inventory for several years now, and I'm here to present an update on climate pollution or greenhouse gas emissions associated with Ann Arbor for calendar year 2021. Greenhouse gas inventories take many forms for many different purposes. This community-wide greenhouse gas emissions inventory estimates major sources of emissions associated with Ann Arbor, like using electricity and natural gas, burning fossil fuels in our cars and vehicles, and disposing materials. It's estimated on an annual basis. Some of the sources I use are not available at the level of granularity of the community of Ann Arbor and are based on modeled or scaled data. For more information on the data sources I use, the methodology and assumptions in preparing the inventory, please visit a20.org. This is also not going to be an exhaustive list of every source of emissions that are associated with our community. One tricky thing that's especially hard to calculate are those associated with goods and services. So if you are particularly interested in those associated with your household, I'd recommend you check out Berkeley's Cool Climate Calculator. So I am going to focus today on digging into some recent changes we've seen in emission levels. If you'd like to see more of a deep dive into every emission source, I'd recommend you check out a20.org for some previous reportings. I'm going to start by sharing the general changes we've seen in Ann Arbor's community-wide emissions since 2000, which is the year that we have a baseline established. This chart shows the overall trends in climate pollution or greenhouse gas emissions and sources that we have comparable data for in 2000 and then in 2015 through 2019, or pre-pandemic levels. In 2000, greenhouse gas emissions were roughly 2.4 million metric tons of carbon dioxide equivalent, which factors in the global warming impact of multiple greenhouse gases. You'll see that throughout the rest of the slides. This level is equivalent to 40 million tree seedlings grown over 10 years and doing that for each year. So it's a lot of emissions. In 2019, we've seen a 25% reduction in these emission sources. This chart illustrates what sectors have seen significantly lower emission levels since 2000. That is primarily from residential and commercial and institutional buildings, because buildings in commercial and institutional or U of M buildings have changed hands over the years. They're combined here, have a more comparable amount. Again, over 80% of these changes and emissions we've seen are associated with the energy used in our buildings. While we actually consume more energy in our buildings today, these emissions have fallen as electricity from the grid becomes cleaner. In addition, the average vehicle on the road is more fuel efficient than those available in 2000. With that context in mind, I'd like to take a look at the last 2 years of emissions. So the COVID-19 pandemic disrupted our lives in many ways, from stay-at-home orders, financial hardship, workforce shifts, families disrupted, and lives lost. But we also saw empty streets and shifts in where we spent our time and paid for electricity. 2020 emissions were 37% lower than 2000 levels, and 2021 emissions raised back up and were 31% lower than 2000 levels. And so I want to dig into where we saw these changes. To do so, I am going to look at an inventory that includes more emission sources than we have data for 2000. I designate these by calling them the simple inventory and the expanded inventory. The largest impact is the inclusion of commuting passenger vehicles or commuting patterns, which is more significant. And so I'm going to also stop comparing to 2000 levels. So this is that same trend I showed earlier, again, not showing the baseline, but including 2020 and 2021. You'll see the emissions levels are higher as we include more emission sources. 67%, or roughly 2/3 of those emissions, come from our community's residential, commercial, and institutional buildings. And an additional 3% comes from the upstream emissions associated with the use of electricity and natural gas in those buildings. Transportation, including those commuting patterns, represents 28% of our community's emissions, and disposal of solid waste and the treatment of wastewater represents the remaining 2% of community-wide emissions. Also, a quick note on upstream emissions. There are much more that aren't included here. I mentioned emissions associated with generating the goods and services that we consume, Fugitive natural gas emissions at the point of production aren't currently included. It's challenging to get an accurate estimate of those emissions based on the data that we have available. Again, I'd recommend you check out the Cool Climate Calculator if those are ones you really want to dig into. But just wanted to caveat this. So this chart shows where the sources of our emissions come from. So we see electricity, natural gas, the upstream emissions associated with that, propane, vehicle fuel, and our waste streams. Overall, we can see a trend in emissions dropping from electricity and in vehicle fuel. And here is that broken out for 2021 with a little bit more detail. So from 2019 to 2021, emissions dropped 11% overall. Again, we largely see those emissions changes happening in our buildings and from transportation. So residential buildings emissions dropped 8%, commercial and institutional buildings 10%, and transportation dropped 18%. Also, we're taking a look at emission levels in our buildings. Residential buildings, including multifamily, represent 22% of community-wide emissions. So slightly more emissions here are associated with electricity than with natural gas, and a small amount attributed to propane. And again, we see that variability and emissions associated with electricity. These are the emissions for commercial and industrial buildings, which represent 16% of community-wide emissions. This sector is the least certain for calendar year 2021, as DT has not yet been able to share community-wide aggregate consumption data for this sector. So this year is based off of an estimate of a trend line for previous years and a comparison to University of Michigan's electricity consumption, which it tends to track. We see a pretty large dip in consumption in our commercial buildings in 2020, as office buildings and commercial spaces were slightly less occupied. Also, unlike residential buildings, commercial buildings, electricity consumption is highly correlated to how hot it is outside and use of air conditioning. And so 2020 was not a relatively cool year. 2021 was even hotter. So this might be underrepresenting these emissions. And then the University of Michigan's use of electricity and natural gas represents a little less than 30% of community-wide emissions, compared to 37% for the rest of the community's buildings. Electricity and natural gas consumption is publicly available through the University of Michigan's environmental metrics. And we know, so emissions from electricity consumption are driven by two factors: how much of it we consume and what was used to generate it. So from 2019 to 2020, we saw a pretty large shift in not only what sectors were consuming electricity, but also DT's fuel mix as it shifted away from coal heavily for a year. And then back in 2021, it came back up again. And just to flip through, you can kind of see in buildings, this general trend line follows that of how much fossil fuel is and coal is included in DT's fuel mix. I also want to touch on things like offsets and voluntary green power purchases. These aren't included in official greenhouse gas inventories, as these purchases don't directly impact emissions associated with the community. The intent is kind of, if you added up everyone's greenhouse gas inventories, it would represent total emissions occurring. However, it is helpful for informational purposes to see that Ann Arbor's residential participation in mine green power makes up about 10% of electricity consumption, which was estimated by the number of enrolled customers. And complete data isn't available for the commercial class. So these changes in building emissions make up about 50% of the reductions from 2019 to 2021. Changes in transportation make up the other half of emissions reductions. You can see here, passenger vehicles and commuting make up the majority of Ann Arbor's transportation emissions. And these changes are due to how much we use our vehicles. So Google's Environmental Insights Explorer provides annual estimates for vehicles miles traveled for the purpose specifically for greenhouse gas inventories. So we can see this large dip in 2020 as the vehicles or the miles we travel in our vehicles dropped over 30%, and then a bump back up in 2021, not quite at pre-pandemic levels, but much higher than 2020. Again, 2020 was an anomalous year with this large drop in greenhouse gas emissions that we saw. I reviewed those emissions last year, acknowledging that some of the drivers and reductions would likely not be continued into the future, like these lower VMT levels that we saw. However, I do want to mention that commuting patterns are a significant source of emissions for Ann Arbor, and continuing to allow employees to work from home is one powerful tool to reduce them. So I want to return to the action Ann Arbor needs to meet A20 goals of carbon neutrality by 2030. So we've seen an overall drop in emissions since 2000. A lot of that is attributed to a cleaner grid. I want to emphasize, however, that if we immediately switched all of our electricity to 100% renewable energy, that we still have a lot of work to reach A20. So this little green line shows that exact hypothesis, or not scenario of, let's just say all our electricity is 100% renewable. We still have a long way to go. We would still need to electrify our buildings and our vehicles and implement widespread energy efficiency improvements to help make those changes more affordable. I also only touched on data on emissions today, but A20 also addresses important improvements to our community, like centering actions on equity, increasing resilience, and strengthening our social cohesion that isn't measured in greenhouse gas emissions. For more information on the A20 plan and the greenhouse gas inventory, visit a20.org. Here's a screenshot so you can see where the navigation is to the community greenhouse gas inventory. For specific questions on the inventory, feel free to send me an email that's listed here. And thank you for your time, and I'm happy to answer any questions that you might have.
So why don't we leave the slides up?
I can do that. Yep. I'll go for that.
So if anybody has a question, unmute yourself and pose the question to Thea. Go ahead, Gabe.
Hi, Thea. Thanks so much. I was looking at the slide of, I believe it was DTE's energy mix, where it shows that I think the average is somewhere around 80%, where being sort of fossil fuel or carbon intensive fuel sources, if I'm reading that correctly. And I think what I was wondering is, are there potential options, both in terms of the seasonality, but also in terms of timing, with the mix of fuel itself, and I'm thinking about solar, the time of when solar comes on, the time of when wind comes on, and things like that. And if there is potentially variation that might allow the city of Ann Arbor and residents to be able to sort of utilize cleaner fuel sources versus dirtier fuel sources.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting concept, and I'm not an expert here, so I wouldn't take what I have to say as the end all be all. I mentioned that looking at cooling degree days, which is how we track how different years vary in terms of how warm or cold they are, because that directly relates to how much natural gas we use to heat our homes and how much electricity we use for air conditioning. And I mentioned that 2021 was a really hot year, which means that when we use a lot of AC in the summer, utilities end up using peaker plants, and those might be using coal as a hypothesis. I don't know if that's actually why the use of coal bumped up again in 2021, but I could see helping offset emissions that way. One of the things I also estimate is transmission and distribution losses, which is when electricity travels from where it's generated to where it's used. It's not 100% efficient process, and we lose some of that energy as it happens. And those are higher the hotter it is out. So those are days when it's even more beneficial to use on-site renewable generation like solar. So great point.
Others?
I have a quick question.
Go ahead, Councilmember Riggs.
Yeah, so I know that in our climate action plan, in terms of how we break out the different sectors of emissions, transportation is by some viewed as kind of artificially low because it's not, I don't believe it was incorporating that sort of commuting behavior, but it looks like within this greenhouse gas inventory, the commuting patterns are being brought back into this. So I'm just curious, I want to make sure I'm understanding, being able to compare the plan to the greenhouse gas inventory. Is that calculating the, pre-pandemic 80,000 folks who are commuting into Ann Arbor every day, or what commuting behavior are we measuring?
Yeah, I don't believe the estimates in the H0 plan have been updated, but I would want to confirm that. Mm-hmm. I will say we know that commuting patterns are important, and that's why the H0 plan addresses it through some actions. There are other actions in the H0 plan as well that we aren't able to estimate, like things having to do with sustainable food, although right now we're not able to get a super meaningful impact estimate of that, even though dairy and beef is a really significant source of emissions. I would say taking the greenhouse gas inventory with a grain of salt maybe is helpful, only knowing that no estimate will ever be 100% complete, but we do know through context what's important and significant, even if we don't have an exact number for it. So we knew that commuting was important. It is included in terms of the actions that address it, but I don't think it's included in terms of an estimate, if that answers your question.
Yeah, I think so. I just wanted to clarify. So the commuting, what we're measuring here is the in and out sort of.
Yes, both inbound and outbound commuting behavior, and that's based off of SEMCOG has an estimate on that, and that's the data source for this.
Great, thank you. Appreciate that.
Can I follow up on that real quickly? That means commuting is miles outside of the city limits of Ann Arbor.
That is correct. So you see I break out commuting and passenger vehicles. Right. So the passenger vehicles, I think, is primarily inboundary, or at least emissions that should be associated directly with the Ann Arbor through the greenhouse gas protocol. And commuting I have separated out as it is primarily outside the boundaries of Ann Arbor, but we know it's significant and from public input and so on, we know it's an important source of emissions to address and estimate.
So this is an important resource for all of us, as well as many others, including just frankly informational resource. I would ask that you footnote that so people can understand that. I don't know that that's necessarily obvious to the layperson that takes a look at this. So if you wouldn't mind, you could footnote that on the chart when you post that, both in Legistar again, maybe we can update it, as well as on the city website. Commissioner Peck.
Thanks. I really appreciate the thoroughness of this. It's a really nice job. Do you have a way of, you mentioned goods and services and methane leakage, and that you have to eventually get to those numbers. And I'm just wondering if you have an idea of what ballpark figures would be, because I'm guessing goods and services especially is a pretty large number. And we would need to start working on a strategy for that sooner than later. And methane leakage, probably DTE tries to make it sound trivial, but I don't think it is. And at U of M, there is a group over in CLASP that's working on the leakage, Eric Court and his students. And then in C's, Greg Chioli is trying to work on scope 3 and getting a lot more detail on that modeled. So there might be some synergies in reaching out to those groups if you need it.
Yeah, that's a great point. And just to add, I know in previous years I've shared an estimate for goods and services The Berkeley Cool Climate Calculator also provides, by zip code and by municipality, an estimate of greenhouse gas emissions by household, which includes that goods and services, and then multiply that with the number of households in Ann Arbor. That kind of gives you an estimate of the scale that we're looking at, which is helpful to understand that it's a large source of emissions. It is, however, a snapshot in time. I think the last year of emissions that was available was 2016 or so, somewhere around there. Because we're on a 2030 timeline and trying to see changes happen quickly, I think it can be frustrating not having a source of data that is more regularly updated. So that's one of the things there. I am so excited and hope U of M or some other entity has some capacity to help estimate those. I know with our circular economy work that we're definitely interested. Did I freeze? No. Okay, cool. We're definitely interested in those. And on the note of the upstream fugitive methane emissions associated with natural gas production, so this currently estimates or includes the estimates of those that DT provides, but not the ones that the source of production. Again, another significant emission source that we know happens. We know it's a good thing to reduce natural gas emissions because estimates of the scale of those vary widely from large to very, very large. So I would just to more acknowledge that we know they happen. We know they're large. We know they need to be addressed. Doesn't mean we can't work on them.
On one hand, the natural gas might be, we can just sort of ignore, because as we go, we phase out gas, we'll get that benefit. And I know you would like to see that benefit. That's always a nice thing to see. On the purchased goods, at least, and maybe services, it could be conceivable. I mean, you can obviously work offline with Greg. And I could introduce you if you don't already know him, or any one of the C's folks on this council commission could do that. But we could also ask Greg to give a presentation on it. He did all the modeling for the University of Michigan's carbon neutrality plan. And so this was the one thing that we had to punt on because we couldn't get it done in a year and a half. So it's being completed now. But it would be really interesting, even if we can't estimate it and certainly can't estimate it every year for Ann Arbor, to at least be able to get our hands around where are the knobs we could turn to reduce it.
Great.
Just let me know if you want to help. Thanks.
Commissioner McKenna.
Hi, Thea. Thanks for your work here. Really clear presentation of the breakdown of the emissions. Just scrolling through the 820 plan in this most recent iteration, and I'm starting to think about, just if you go to the slide where you're showing the drop in emissions, or like the dotted line with that's an enormous task, and it's obviously intersectional, but also happening in all the different departments. Just wondering how you communicate the barriers. And I know that's not the purpose of what you shared with us, but thinking about how we actually actionalize these savings. I think that when I see this presentation, I think about, okay, I'm thinking through the technologies, I'm thinking through the energy sources that provide all of our power and fuel our buildings, but I feel like that positions it as like a technology problem. And I think that most of us know that there's an enormous organizational kind of challenge to making this happen, from what we heard about earlier to the way the utilities serve new developments, to the existing housing and all the gas and inefficiency of the older housing stock. So not to get into too much specific detail on like what all the barriers are, I just wanted to ask you as representative of OSI and maybe of this work, like, how do you talk about the barriers when you talk about the emissions savings and kind of like the really troubling slope of this dotted line?
Yeah, I will caveat this. kind of like taking a step away from the greenhouse gas inventory, I'm here presenting these numbers to us all because I think all of us care in the room deeply about, greenhouse gas emissions as a concept, of needing to reduce them, of wanting to know where we are on track to get them to zero. I think it's been proven, however, that knocking on someone's door or talking to someone you find on the street, talking about emissions and the levels and having to reduce them isn't really a successful or productive way of carrying out that conversation of driving action. One, it is a crazy number to look at, and you either throw up your hands and say there's no way we're going to do it, or the damage has already been done, or someone will design some perfect technology that will fix this problem for us. Kind of going to the natural gas topic on its own, I think there's been a lot of great research that shows that what people most identify from or respond to is hearing the health and safety impacts of having natural gas in our buildings and how it directly impacts ourselves and our children and your neighbors and other people in your communities. So while I'm here today presenting on numbers, I acknowledge that this might not be the most meaningful message for the majority of the people in our community. But thank you, Commissioner McKenna. That was a great question.
Any others speak up or raise your hand? So I have a number of points. I looked at this ahead of time, and if I may, some I may just send to you directly, but I have, I think, several questions or comments that are of interest to the group. First of all, I want to respond before I forget to Commissioner Peck's statement about methane leakage related emissions and the comment that will become less of a concern as we electrify. I just want to tie that point to the point that Ken Garber made when he called in. And I'd just like to note that since June 1st, 2020, an additional 529 residential units that are going to be fired, so to speak, by natural gas have been approved. And so those are not yet, probably very few of those are reflected here because those are just approvals. And as he mentioned, the number of units that are coming online just from the village of Ann Arbor is going to be another 320 units in addition to that. Commissioner Peck, I see you raised your hand. Maybe I misunderstood you, but go ahead.
Not at all. But what you're getting me to realize is maybe we need to get a lot more serious about a natural gas ban and just go all out and marshal whatever we need to do it. Because I look at this curve that we see here, and I see it, I see optimism. In other words, it looks like we're going down, and we're going to keep going down at the same rate if we're good. But we all know that that's going to take increasing amount of work, at least to deal with some of these really big problems like you're raising. And we need to we need to get to a tipping point on that in order to sharpen the descent, to steepen it. And I know that's just, so I totally agree with you that we got to do something about it.
So let me play catch ball with you of ideas, and then Commissioner McKenna, I'll get to you. First of all, I would like to point out, and Thea, this is one correction that I'd like you to make. This is a little bit misleading. You show it in the sense that you have it grade, but if anyone makes a mental best fit slope from 2000 to 2020 and looks at that rate of improvement, that's misleading because you have roughly to the middle of the chart, maybe 40% of the chart, a 20-year time span, and then from 2020 over, you have a 10-year time span. So the slope of improvement that I might eyeball from 2000 to 2020 or 2021 looks relatively steep. but it's really nowhere near as steep as that. And we know that 2021 was probably still not a typical year in Ann Arbor because of the pandemic and the associated changes in behaviors. I agree completely with you, Commissioner Peck. This shows that we have a big task in front of us. And because of what we're doing with new buildings being fired by natural gas, that's adding to the problem. We are looking, there was a ordinance revisions committee meeting that entertained a proposal from the planning department that would introduce effectively a natural gas ban through zoning. That is hopefully one of the topics that we're going to be discussing in a joint meeting with the Planning Commission. I provided last week information showing that the city of Boston is doing actually much more than that through zoning. Granted, the laws are different in Massachusetts than they are in Ann Arbor or Michigan, but there may be some precedents there that we can rely on, as well as actions taken in a number of other different states that were taken into consideration by Boston. In addition, another possible lever that hopefully we will discuss is looking at our connection fees for water and wastewater. And those are really significant, and we might be able to use those as carrots and sticks to do exactly what you described. Commissioner McKenna.
Hi, thanks. I wanted to comment on this figure again, just kind of add to the conversation about the slope of the line. I think how it is slightly misleading. I agree with that. I'd like to see that change as well. But something that Commissioner Overpeck mentioned kind of gets back to my initial question about what are the obstacles to actually achieving this drop off. And it's actually more of a stepwise function, right? Like you can't like gradually decarbonize natural gas. And so I think that it might be an interesting next step to add to the conversation. I mean, you know, we know that, I think from what I've heard from what the city talks about for the A20 plan, even if we're, you know, and maybe the Planning Commission is considering a natural gas ban as well. Talking about getting rid of natural gas is like, it's a full piece of what needs to go away. I think that that's more sophisticated. And I think that when you look at, you know, this 8 years that we have to go, we need to get more sophisticated. And I think we need to bring ourselves and the public along with like having a more sophisticated conversation about what it's going to take. And then just while I have the floor, I also wanted to mention that I mentioned this briefly in my intro, but I actually worked with the 17 cities and towns in Massachusetts, including Boston and Cambridge, to write those natural gas bans. So I have an extensive amount of resources on this topic. So definitely like to be involved in future conversations.
Great. Commissioner Peck, did you re-raise your hand or?
Yes, and I get in trouble here because Claire has to finish her PhD. But I think it sounds great what you're saying. Two things. One is that would be what you just recommended would make a even better case than we already have for figuring out what the fugitive emissions are and the upstream emissions, because then we can show people what the true impact would be. And second, with the price of natural gas these days, and what the hell's going on in the world, there's a really big justice issue here too. So we're building in very expensive heating systems here. And I think the last piece of the puzzle would be to really highlight how the indoor air pollution is really bad. I mean, we could create a campaign to really educate everybody that, you know, having a gas burner in your kitchen is really stupid. For your own personal health and that of your children, et cetera. Thanks.
Excellent comments. Councilmember Radina.
Thanks, Chair Mirsky. I know that you're aware of this. Because I've heard it come up in this conversation, I wanted to also bring up a brief update that the city is kind of paying attention also to some state legislation that is moving right now. The Michigan House of Representatives voted out a bill that would preempt local units of government and prohibit us from enacting natural gas bans. There is companion legislation in the state Senate. If that gets moving, we are obviously working with the governor, because it is something that we certainly do not want to prohibit our local unit of government from being able to do, and to take that tool out of our options. The only other question that I maybe have, this was brought up to me recently, and maybe somebody who's more knowledgeable in the subject could help me out a little bit, is if we were to move forward currently, I think slide 14 shows DTE's current electric fuel mix. Given their reliance on coal still, if we were to ban natural gas, a question that I received recently is, in the short term, would that actually make our emission problem worse if we are more reliant on coal as opposed to clean options? And so I wonder if, for folks who are still reliant on DTE and don't have some of the renewable energy options, is that something we should be looking at in the short term? And if you could maybe speak to that a little bit.
So the ban would be a ban for new natural gas connections. So what that would mean is that any new construction would have to be all electric, and therefore it would be net zero ready, dependent on how they're powered. It would not change DTE's fuel mix at all. I think it's what Commissioner Peck mentioned is important, though, is that if these new connections are fired by natural gas, it's very likely that natural gas prices will go up for some of the reasons he mentioned, but also because a lot of the fracked wells they've gotten out the easy gas, and they're having to go to more and more difficult gas to extract, which means that the prices are going to most likely go up. Commissioner McKenna, do you still have your hand up? Or yeah, go ahead. And then Commissioner Berkowitz.
Yes, if I may, I have a couple of responses to Commissioner Radina. It's an amazing, excellent question, and very much in the minds of our citizens. I wanted to make a couple of points. So I studied this when I was at RMI, and I can share resources. I'd like to also know how to share some resources, so when we can talk about that later. But as of 2019, I found that every single state in the U.S., except for Wyoming, if they switched, basically, if you bought a heat pump over a gas furnace today, whether that be a new home or a replacement, over the lifetime of that equipment, it's net positive emission savings. So it's a better environmental proposition in every single state except for Wyoming, where there's an incredible amount of coal. It's almost like 90%. And so that's with the fuel mix that you're seeing today. I think that's a really important part of the argument. And the other part of that is that it's that stepwise nature of reducing emissions. So if we don't start kind of digging into all of the operational challenges to actually making that happen, to getting rid of natural gas in our buildings, that we actually can't even achieve, all electrification. So it's kind of like those two components.
Thanks for those insights. Commissioner Berkowitz.
Thank you. I also wanted to follow up on City Council Member Radina's question. I think it's a thoughtful one. And just in regard to DTE's electricity mix, and I'm not sure if this is shown here, or probably will, work into the next iteration of this inventory in 2022 or whenever the next update refresh happens. But DTE did retire their River Rouge coal plant in 2021. The last remaining units there, it's kind of a smaller situation at this point because a lot of it was already retired. But in 2022, they retired their Trenton Channel and their St. Clair coal plants. So the number, like the percentage you're seeing here for coal, is going to drop dramatically. The other component is that DTE is filing their next, it's called an integrated resource plan. It's essentially a 15-year plan. They're going to file their next one in early November. And the rumor so far is that they will propose expediting retirements for potentially their Bell River or the Monroe coal plants too. So, nothing is certain there, but the coal numbers are definitely going to go down on there. Unfortunately, the gas numbers are going to go up too. They did build a new large fracked gas plant, the Blue Water Energy Center, to largely replace a lot of that coal capacity. But the renewable figures on there should dramatically increase too. So all that to say, like, electrification still has a net benefit. The fuel mix is getting cleaner in rapidly, like right now. So thank you for that.
Great. Again, thanks for the insights. Thea, I made a bunch of notes here, but I won't go through all of them. One of the things, though, I do want to talk about in this forum is the date of when we can expect these inventories in the future. I know that there was some delays in getting data, as there have been in the past, and there were also maybe some oversights that led to delays. But what we're essentially doing here is driving in the rearview mirror. And that's not so bad when you're on a straight and narrow road and the trend is good, but it's potentially disastrous if we're getting a report like this in October and we don't know that we've had a big problem and we've lost 10 months in trying to rectify that, or let's say 6 or 7 months, especially when we're on the time frame that we're on. So I'm wondering if you can give a commitment to the commission of when we can expect these inventories in the future.
Yeah, it is challenging. I mentioned our largest sources of emissions, if I scroll back up here, are from buildings and transportation. And so our data on the energy that we use in our buildings, electricity and natural gas, comes from DTE. That's not data that we have internally. The delay this year, as Chair Mirsky alluded to, is there was a long delay getting data from DT, and they still have not been able to share data for commercial buildings. In addition, we use the Google Environmental Insights Explorer for information on vehicles miles traveled. Again, that's an estimate that is specifically generated for use in greenhouse gas inventories. That was released late spring of this year. So while I think it would be great if I could, and that's also an emerging data source. So that doesn't quite yet have a consistent date on when it was available. I mentioned it was available late spring of this year. I think the intention is to have this prepared at least by mid-year. That aligns with the deadline that we have to submit a greenhouse gas inventory to the CDP, the Carbon Disclosure Project, which fulfills our obligations that we've committed to through things like the Race to Zero. I think it would be ideal to have this the second the calendar year ends. Ideally, everyone has their data and shares it with us, and then we have a full 12 years to plan. But unfortunately, that is not always how it happens when we're reliant on data from external sources. I hope that provides some clarity.
Yeah, that does. We'll talk about it in agenda items for future meetings where we had the idea of getting DTE in, and maybe there's a couple of topics that we can talk about. I made a note and we can come back to that. For brevity's sake, I think what I will do is maybe send you a bunch of questions that I have. Councilmember Riggs, I'll come to you in just a second. Sorry. And then maybe you can respond to those to me and copy the rest of the commission so that we're not extending this conversation too long. But I don't want, that just applies to me. So anybody else, Councilmember Riggs, we'll start with you.
Thanks. I've mentioned this point at previous meetings, but since we have some new commissioners here tonight and, likely some new audience members as well, I just wanted to bring it up. I think it's pretty frequent that we mention the number of units of housing units that we're adding to the city. And in the conversation that we bring them up in here, that often comes up in a somewhat negative light in terms of how they're powered. And I think the conversation we've had here tonight is incredibly important to be talking about that and to talking about how it meets our A20 goals. but I just want to make sure that at least I am mentioning the fact that we have a multitude of city goals that we're trying to reach, and housing shortage is also amongst them. And so historically, across the United States and also locally, sometimes the environmental movement gets put at odds with sort of the development of housing. And I don't want us to, I know that's not your intent to do that, Chair Mirsky. I know that the work that you do also in the community on this issue of housing. So I know that's not your intent, but just to point out that that's also very important for us to be increasing our housing stock, and that we are trying to, as quickly as possible, figure out how we can legally take the steps that we need to take in our community to power our new housing appropriately. But for folks who are interested, there's a great book I read recently, Golden Gates, The Housing Crisis and a Reckoning for the American Dream, that goes into this, and is a really great read or a great audiobook.
Thanks for sharing that. I would just remind everyone of our last meeting, where we had a presentation that showed that we can indeed have affordable and sustainable housing. Any other comments? So Thea, thank you very much. We are blessed to have you in OSI and doing these inventories. I know this is one hell of a task, and I know that you're really good at this, and we really appreciate it. And thanks for sharing this with us. And we'll look forward to having you back, hopefully in June or July of next year, telling us about 2022.
Thank you for the time tonight, commissioners.
Thanks. So, Zach, I think just a second, where's my agenda here? Let's page over. So yes, now we're going to have an update on home energy rating disclosure. And some of the longer time commissioners will remember that Zach made a presentation back in February. And so we now have an update, and I'm going to let you steer the meeting. Go ahead, Zach.
Great. Yeah, some of this might look a little familiar to those of you who were here back in February when I gave this presentation. So this will be for those of you who are new, and kind of an update for those who saw it before. And it is on the HERD program, or Home Energy Rating Disclosure. So what is that? That is a program that is designed really to make the energy consumption of a home easier for future owners to understand. A lot like the miles per charge rating on an electric vehicle. And I'm going to reference only electric vehicles in the spirit of electrification. And it focuses on residential single-family homes. And we have a number of different initiatives that are addressing other types of buildings. And I'll touch on that a little bit here. But what is this program, and why do we need that? So to expand on what I've said already a little more, is that we want to make sure that everybody has the detailed information that they need to make wise home purchasing decisions. They can benefit from that in a couple of ways. It gives them a bigger picture of what they're getting when they buy a house. And then should they choose to prioritize energy efficiency once they own the home, then they'll have more information to help them make decisions about those projects and those investments. And so over time, we hope that this will ultimately drive a market push that values energy efficiency and ultimately reduces carbon emissions in line with the A20 plan. This is some of those other initiatives that I mentioned. Commercial benchmarking was passed by City Council last October. Green rental housing will be following HERD shortly after that, so later this year. Commercial energy audit disclosure is not something that is yet in place, but that is where we could possibly close that gap for buildings that are smaller than 20 square feet and then are not covered by the commercial benchmarking. But what this does cover are single dwelling units. So whether it's a standalone home, or it is row houses or townhomes or a duplex, if it's single family and it's being sold, it will be included. So what's this program all about? Well, to answer the why, we should start from the beginning. And with A20, there are these 7 strategies outlined. The herd ordinance falls squarely into strategy 3. That is to significantly improve the energy efficiency of our buildings. That's what those other suite of ordinances are addressing. Following that, by virtue of being a decarbonization effort, it could also help with the electrification strategy as well. And so this is just a different iteration of the table I showed you a moment ago. The herd ordinance would be the second of this suite of 3 programs. So just to further build the case for the herd program, I want to demonstrate that on paper, sustainability and energy efficiency are important to real estate agents. They believe that things like the utility bill is important to their home buyers. You can see here that they understand that this is something that is important to home buyers and that they want to be able to highlight when a building performs well. Some full disclosure is that there are some real estate agents who are a little reluctant to support this initiative. And I just want to name that because it becomes a really vital piece of our outreach efforts. And so a lot of the conversation that we'll be having today is about the ordinance, but I want you to understand that accompanying that ordinance would be a strong outreach and resource availability for real estate agents. And so to share a little bit more about the why of this program, are that right now there isn't any such thing in place, and owner-occupied homes and single-family homes have very few points of intervention where the city of Ann Arbor can leverage resources to help homeowners make the right decisions. And so by increasing the literacy of home energy efficiency, it naturally leads that consumer action, consumers who have information about the performance of their homes and the energy costs and what sort of improvements they can make, it naturally follows. That then drives economic development. There will be job creation as a result of local investment in energy savings. We will need home energy assessors and energy efficiency contractors who can do this work. The community development component of it are that it clarifies and helps to address some of the energy burden risk, especially for low to moderate income households who are looking to buy in Ann Arbor. Right now, it's kind of a blind purchase. At least on paper, you can request some documentation from DTE about the previous year of energy consumption at a house that you're looking to buy, but otherwise, a lot of that information is in the dark, and you're kind of rolling the dice when you buy a house, hoping that it's not an energy hog. And so therefore there is strong consumer protection in that it informs a lot of that home buying process. Some of the direct benefits to the home buyer are sort of as I just mentioned. They give a total cost of living figure, which is broader and more encapsulating than simply the home price. And it helps them make cost-effective efficiency improvements, lowers energy costs to support lower income households. For those who are selling their home, excuse me, and who will, under this ordinance, this draft ordinance, be required to get a home energy score, they then get to showcase the cost-effective energy efficiency upgrades that maybe they've already done. And that can in turn increase the value of the home that those that have higher energy scores anyhow. And I want to make an important note there that that doesn't mean that those with lower scores are devalued. We've seen a few home energy scores get implemented across the country, and in every situation, what we find is that this is an additive value, and it only makes it a stronger case when you're trying to sell your house, rather than lowering this cost of any home that doesn't have a high score. Homes that have energy scores tend to sell faster, and that benefits the real estate agents. When they are giving a better, more complete picture to potential home buyers, it's more attractive to those home buyers. It's also providing a better service to them. You're preventing situations where a home buyer could be disappointed in the home that they bought. And this helps to standardize a comfortable method of discussing energy performance with clients. It's a topic that, in my conversations with real estate agents, is difficult to bring up. Not every home buyer is interested in it, and if they are, don't know how to talk about it. And so having something in place like HERD sort of standardizes those conversations. And then, of course, overall, we're looking at community-wide carbon reductions, which also benefit the health and safety and comfort of these homes. So just briefly, the Home Energy Score is an initiative of the Department of Energy, which is why it has been chosen for this. That's also the same method that other municipalities who have passed similar ordinances, they also use the Home Energy Score. And so if you get a 5 on your Home Energy Score, it says you're using about 50% more energy than, I'm sorry, you're using about the same energy. It's about 50% of the homes. If you are getting a 10, that's the best that you can get on this scale. And it says that you have a pretty highly efficient home. And then everything that is below that, conversely is, or it tracks appropriately with the score. So a little bit of the process is that a DOE home energy assessor evaluates the home's total energy use, and then they put the assessment into a report, and that report includes not just the home energy score, but the data that they use to calculate that home energy score. They would give you energy use estimates on any improvements that you might make, and they can include improvement recommendations, specifically those that have a 10-year or less payback. Excuse me. And so those are the things that we would expect to see in the home energy scores in this policy. And then in terms of the broader impact, you have a better sense of the high leverage upgrades as a new homeowner. And so the home energy score can recommend those efficiency upgrades, which is high impact for making those decisions for the first projects that you do. The most new homeowners make major project decisions within about a year of owning the house. Doesn't mean that they do them necessarily, but that's usually when the decisions are made. And if you are equipped with the information up front upon new ownership about energy efficiency, it kind of guides a lot of those, at least informs those decisions. And then overall, it lowers your energy costs. So it's kind of a win-win situation. I've mentioned a couple of other municipalities who are doing something similar. Portland, Oregon is doing it, and now several of the surrounding municipalities are also doing it. Milwaukee and Beaverton are following suit. Chicago has seen some of that, as well as Austin, Texas. And these are where we're getting some of those stats that say that homes sell quicker, for instance, than those that don't have home energy scores. That's what we're seeing across the board. So it's overall beneficial. there's a lot of information from ACEEE about energy savings and how that benefits homes. They also do a deep dive into energy burdened residents. And what they are finding is that those residents who are energy burdened have increased starting in 2020. And that's a trend that has continued. And so it could be COVID related. It was already on the climb though. And so we're hoping to address some of those energy burdened households through an ordinance such as this. And so to give you a sense of the timeline, going back in time, starting around this time of year last year, we were working with some of the work that the Energy Commission had done previously to put together this ordinance. And we began talking with real estate agents and their community and learning from them, having conversations, understanding pain points, et cetera. Earlier this year, what we were exploring was a voluntary pilot program, and that was in discussion at the last time that I gave this presentation. The voluntary pilot program was slated prior to a millage, and with the millage coming about, we decided to put a hold on the voluntary program, especially if this ordinance is going to move forward on the timeline that we are expecting, which is that it could feasibly be passed before the end of this year. That would mean that we had just a couple of months to launch a voluntary program that may or may not have had much benefit if it's ultimately going to be required anyway. And so instead, what we did over the summer was work with a fellow who did really great work putting together messaging and marketing materials so that once we know what is going to happen with HERD, and what I mean by that is whether or not council will pass this ordinance, we will be ready to go and hit the ground running. We have everything in place to do outreach and community engagement. And we are expected to do a full program launch early next year, starting right away as soon as this ordinance passes. So that's where it stands. I will let your questions guide the rest of this conversation.
Thank you, Zach.
Mm-hmm.
So that slide that you showed last, just since you were right on it, that's the old slide that we showed in February, correct? And
correct.
It's no longer the current plan. I think you just said we're not going to do the voluntary program implementation and so on and so forth, right?
That's correct.
Yeah, okay.
Yes, thanks for clarifying. The reason that I left it on here is to show that that's what was in place the last time that we spoke.
Right.
All future items that are on this timeline still stand. So we haven't lost any time.
The legal review is slated for the first quarter or has already been completed?
It's in process right now, so it should be done. I mean, it'll have to be before the ordinance moves forward, but we're hoping to get feedback from legal stat hopefully anytime now, and that really, once we get that legal, we will be prepared to move forward.
Great. So I'd like to open things for question and answer and discussion. There's two other elements of this topic. So we actually have the ordinance itself, which we can get into if appropriate. And then we have a resolution of support. And so we'll need a motion to consider that and a second. This is effectively the second reading since we did look at this back in February. So let's start with questions about the presentation. We have two up, Councilmember Briggs and then Commissioner Harp.
Yeah, thank you. And thanks for the update on this. Excited for it to make it to the council table. I'm curious, when it does, what sort of, you've done a lot of stakeholder engagement and discussions around this, what sort of feedback would we anticipate, for example, from the Realtors Association about this? Was there support or mixed feelings, or what's the sentiment you're getting?
Yeah, really good question. We have gotten mixed feelings. Part of that is because, like we have seen in some other communities and we've seen here previously in Ann Arbor, that mostly there tends to be misunderstanding. During the conversations with them about what this means, we find that most realtors then actually are quite amenable to this and friendly to it. And so that's where it's the engagement strategy that we spent all summer building, and some of those messaging tactics really come into play. For example, there was, let me see if I can rack my brain here. In a conversation with one of them, there was the county had passed I think it was a water related requirement that they must pass a certain test. And there was a qualifier to that they had to achieve a certain score. And if the house didn't get a good enough score, they had to make those changes. A lot of the misunderstanding comes in around HURD is that they thought, and some still think, that they need to achieve a certain score before the house can sell. And that is not what HURD is requiring. HURD is not requiring any changes whatsoever. It simply is requiring the score. It then allows the home buyer to make decisions about what they want to do when they take ownership of the home. So that's I think where one of the biggest sticking points are. We have been putting together, with the help of Joe on the line, a website that will be a resource hub for really anybody that can be involved in this process. So there will be information for real estate agents, home buyers, home sellers, and energy assessors and contractors who do that. And so with that resource hub, we hope to address a lot of these potential concerns before they become major concerns. And that's something that you won't see in the ordinance, because we want to make sure that we can adapt. If a certain messaging or outreach tactic is not working, we don't want to have to seek council's approval to change the ordinance, to change our outreach. But that is something that's really critical to keep in the back of your minds, is that the OSI will be accompanying this initiative, if it moves forward to become an official ordinance, with a lot of engagement to make sure that we're answering those questions appropriately.
Commissioner Hart.
Thank you so much for the presentation. I was really excited to dig into this, and I think a lot of the questions, as I read through both the ordinance and the slides as well, some of that was answered too in the research report from the Department of Energy that went into some of the detail about some of the measures and some of the calculations that went in. So it answered a lot of my questions as well about not only the sort of plan for improving the metrics over time, but the sort of regional climate and grid emissions calculations, or excuse me, context that goes into, I think, some of the reporting metrics that come out with the assessment as well, if I understood that correctly. And so that helped me get a sense of how they would be made comparable, but also the sort of types of data that went into it. There were two main sort of areas of questions that I was sort of left with, and you talked about these a little bit. One was this sort of question of who's doing the assessment and what the handoff looks like between the score itself, but also the report that comes with that. And I wondered if you could talk a little bit more about that handoff and how that might be reflected in the ordinance, in particular, because one of the key things I'm curious about is how do we help ensure that someone who ends up purchasing or buying the home actually has the report and the knowledge and the insights the actions to take in ways that help them sort of support decision making or actually help them make improvements or decisions about what kinds of actions they'll take. And part of that was I was just wondering how, in particular, the real estate agent might get that directly to a buyer, but also perhaps an inspector who might be working with a buyer to help interpret and understand some of that information as well in the process of purchasing a home. And then the second piece, which I can sort of follow up, was a little bit about the artifact or the report document itself and how the structure of that. I saw the example from Portland. How can that best help support decision making? And I was particularly looking at some of the items, are the suggested improvements, for example, prioritized in a particular order, or what kinds of ways in which can they be set up? And that's something I think that comes out in the making, but I was just wondering if you had any thoughts about that as well.
Sure. So the ordinance specifically, to address your first question, the ordinance specifically names that the home energy score information must be listed in the home listing. That involves a conversation with the MLS, the local organization that handles all of the house listings, the multiple listing service. And they can actually add fields and have added fields in the past for things such as energy efficiency. And so the ordinance requires that the home energy score be added there. And that's one of the places where we will be doing outreach with the MLS to make sure that that field gets added so that it's nice and easy for real estate agents to include that information in a listing, as well as for potential buyers to find that information. Now, in terms of the report, that's something that is, because it was obtained by the seller, it is supposed to be made available upon request by the potential home buyer. Your second question was about, jog my memory, I'm sorry.
Sorry, about the report document itself.
Yeah.
And the type of information, the way in which the information is presented, the sort of quality of the information about the improvements, in part because I found that a lot of the way in which those improvements, and you can go, for example, look at the DTE site in terms of how they communicate energy efficiency improvements and things like that, and the kinds of steps they can take. But also the Portland example that you included at the bottom, I think, of the ordinance. There may be better versus worse ways of presenting some of that information, ways that will help, I think, homeowners make choices about what to do, when to do it, how much, and in what process.
Yeah, so that's a good question. There are actually requirements from the DOE about what information is included in those reports and how they get that information. And they go as far as having a quality assurance checks for that. So what I took out of this presentation, but perhaps maybe should have left in from February, was a little bit more information about that. We would have to find a DOE partner, and there are a couple of options here in the Ann Arbor and Detroit area for who we can work with in terms of home energy assessors. And then the DOE does, I think it's a 5% quality control check. So they'll pull those reports and go over them with the home energy assessor to identify how they got that information and identify any potential miscalcs or things that they can improve on. So there's some quality control in there, and then we can further work with the partners and via the DOE to identify if there are other certain things that we want to make sure are included in that report. So for example, one thing that has already been in discussion to include in the Ann Arbor reports are something like EV readiness. That's not already standard in a home energy score as it is delivered from the DOE, but it is something that locally has been expressed as a desire to be included in that. So we would work with our partner to make sure that that information is also in the home energy score.
Councilmember Rodino.
Thank you. I have a couple of questions, and I would, I guess I'll start by saying I think I appreciate kind of the work that's being done on this and some of the outreach that's taking place. I do think that there probably needs to be some additional outreach to realtors. I am already hearing from realtors kind of anticipating this, and I have heard a lot of unanimity across the board in their opposition to this. So I would actually love to also talk to some realtors who might be supportive so that I can hear that perspective as well as somebody who will have to vote on this at the council table. One of the questions that I have is about kind of the mechanism for what the process is for doing some of these assessments. One of the concerns that I have heard is that mandating this without necessarily knowing if we have the proper channels in place for these to be carried out regularly could add a lot of backlog to the buying and selling process as sellers are waiting for these assessments to take place. So do you know if there's currently kind of enough folks who can do these assessments in place for if we were to implement this, that it wouldn't dramatically impact the housing market?
Yeah, that is one that we have heard a lot as well. So this was also something I took out of the previous. I was trying to save time, but should have left it all in the presentation. Some of those that we're working with are already prepared to help us meet that demand. So there are already a few home energy assessors in the area. One of the partners that we could potentially work with is Walker Miller. They're based out of Detroit. And they specifically are focused on helping to provide home energy assessments, but also workforce development for that as well. And so they are working on partnerships with local high schools and colleges to get folks trained up and into that field at really opportune times and equip them with the skills to be in the green economy. And so that includes training them up to be home energy assessors. And so they have some capacity and are equipped to do that. Green Home Institute is another one that is prepared to help with that. And then I will also state that there is some discussion about making some of the potential millage funds, if residents choose to pass that next month, available to hire perhaps an in-house assessor who could also help address with some of that. With some of all of that said, RMI what helped us put together some numbers on what we would need and what sort of demand that would put on our local energy assessors. And they found that 4 energy assessors would be able to meet the need. There are fewer than about 2,000 homes sold in Ann Arbor each year. And so that's 4 energy assessors full-time should be able to meet that. There are also some other energy assessors who are already in the area that aren't actively doing a whole lot of these. And so they could be engaged. And we also do already have some funds designated towards, we are prepared to do some trainings for free from the city that we would put some folks through the DOE training program.
Thanks. And then maybe as a follow-up to that, I wonder if you don't have this, I will have another opportunity to ask these questions, but since we might vote on a resolution tonight, in some of the other places where this has been instituted, have you seen is there any data to suggest whether or not this has added any type of considerable cost to the selling process in additional fees, or do you know approximately how much it costs to do one of these assessments?
Yeah, to do one of these assessments is about $200 to $400. It can be cheaper. What we have found in the last couple of years is that has increased to about $200 to $400. So that's the cost that we're looking at. There already are some, in terms of an equity approach, exemptions built into the draft ordinance. So for any homes that homeowners who are low to moderate income, they have the option to apply for an exemption from compliance with this. Now, that said, that's the way the ordinance is worded. Again, our approach to it is not always written into the ordinance. And so the city, of course, would seek out offsetting the cost for those homes rather than allowing them to be foregone completely. And in fact, the current draft says 60% AMI and below are exempt. Portland bumped it up to 80, and we would likely follow suit if that is if that's something that is attractive to this body, and if we have the funding for it also.
Thanks. And then the last thing I'll say is really, I think, more of a comment than anything as you continue to have discussions. I think the thing that I have most heard as a concern is potentially like buyer anxiety, that if they go into a potential purchase and then receive an assessment that demonstrates that the home really is not very efficient and needs a lot of work, that at some point the city may mandate that they make all of those changes. And so I think that's one of the pieces that I've most consistently heard when folks have reached out to me about this, is that it may add some additional anxiety or some additional kind of time to that process as buyers and sellers try to negotiate out whether or not they are mandating that the seller now make some upgrades because they're afraid that they might have to burden that cost later on. And so I don't know if that's something that's come up in your conversations, but just something that I've consistently heard as you continue to talk to realtors.
Yeah, at this time, there is no such. I haven't had any conversations involving that. And I don't anticipate that is anything that would come into play. I will say that with the recent passing of the Inflation Reduction Act, there are a lot of very attractive rebates and tax credits that are available to homeowners who do choose to act on some of the recommendations that are put forth in the home energy score. So for the next 10 years, at least till 2032, it's actually a really good time to be making some of those electrification and efficiency changes.
Councilmember McKenna, did you have a question? Your hand was up a couple of times.
No, it's okay.
Okay. Any other comments or questions before we move on to the associated topics? Zach, I would just ask that you provide some data to council on exactly those cost estimates. I know Eco-Intelligent Homes did a full blower door test on my house, again, a second time last year, and it was, I think, around $200 for a full blower door test. And I know that they're still doing a lot of work in Ann Arbor and were featured at the electrification fair. So before that $200 to $400 range is given, we should provide some data to council. Go ahead, Councilor Bernardino.
Yeah, sorry, and just if that information is being provided also at some point, I would also love to hear if there's what the current timeline is for an assessment to take place, not just like how long the actual assessment would be, but if we were to implement this and had those 4 people in place and somebody requested one, about what length of time they should expect from requesting an assessment to when it would be completed.
Good idea. So the ordinance was posted on Legistar. It sounds like a few people looked at it. Are there any questions or comments about the ordinance before we consider the resolution? Zach, I submitted some questions to you in advance of the meeting, which I think you saw. Would you comment on at least the ordinance related aspects? I can read them, or you can just go ahead and address them directly.
Sure. The first one I'll address is one that I've sort of already addressed. This question was about the city providing certain provisions for either the city or another entity to fund reports. And this question was specifically about the exemptions of low to moderate income households. And so I'll just repeat again that that's something that we would keep an administrative approach so that we can appropriately adapt and adjust as needed to make sure that those are being funded. I'll provide a little more background information on why that was included. And the goal was to not then further burden a household that may already be energy burdened now with the cost of complying with a new ordinance. Even though it's in the spirit of reducing the energy, if you're a low to moderate income household and you're trying to sell your house, we don't want to be burdening you any further. So you can apply for a full exemption. Of course, then if any applications that we receive under that exemption would be met then with, okay, great, now here's how we will help you get it done. But you won't need to legally apply.
Yeah, just for the council members, that cuts two ways. So if you don't do these scores, then you sort of perpetuate these lower income homes that have high utility costs that low income people can't afford. And if they are continually exempted, then they're not aware of that, and they're probably less inclined to make the kind of upgrades that we want to see them make, not only from a greenhouse gas and energy perspective, but also from an affordability perspective. So I think it really is important that we think about how we might be able to provide incentives for those being done. Then there was the other point about calculating greenhouse gas emissions two different ways. Could you comment on that and explain it?
Yeah, I'll I might actually turn this back around to you about exactly what this question was asking. There is a stipulation that says that the home energy score should include an estimate of the home's greenhouse gas emissions based on the home energy score estimate and which fuel types are being used. The question was asking if the second calculation could be if it was 100% renewable electric option, which if it's renewable electrics, doesn't that mean that the greenhouse gas emissions are very low? I mean, outside of doing embodied carbon, I don't think I understand what they're.
No, so there's the typical home in Ann Arbor is going to be greenhouse gas heated, water heated, stove, etc. But then there's also electric power consumption. And so if you have the electric component is going to have a certain cost and a certain greenhouse gas emissions, but most people in Ann Arbor now have an option of subscribing to 100% renewable energy. So one option is through My Green Power. In fact, DTE has a special offering right now. Another option is through Arcadia. A future option might be through community solar on the landfill. And so the idea is that if you provide the information of what the greenhouse gas emissions would be, should they procure their electricity from a 100% renewable source, that would give them an indication of what the benefit would be of subscribing to 100% renewable energy from some source or another.
Yeah, I mean, I think I would, again, turn that back to the body if that's of interest to the Energy Commission. I don't see why that isn't something that we could include. I
mean, you essentially build the multiplication factors in, and then when you spit out the report gives the two different figures and indicates what the benefit is of having 100% renewable energy, which we want to encourage people to do.
Absolutely.
Are there any other comments or questions about the ordinance that people have? If not, we'll move on. Go ahead. Councilmember Calvin Garcia.
There was a section in the ordinance about, under definitions, and it says asset rating. The term asset rating, it says, for existing houses, the asset rating is produced based on an in-house assessment which uses the Department of Energy's home energy score. for new houses, the asset rating may be produced based on design documents for the house. How is that going to be like consistently calculated for new houses? Like in a way that it's replicable and everyone who's doing it is calculating it based on the same criteria.
I found that also confusing, frankly. I didn't understand that whole definition. Sorry, maybe you can explain it or rework it.
Sure. We can rework it. Some of these things also were kind of taken from other municipalities who have something in place. I think an important thing to note here is that new homes, new construction will not be subject to this. They are already getting a HERS rating through the current building code, at least a blower door test. And so they are already rated under another system. So it wouldn't apply to new homes.
Okay.
So, yeah.
So, Zach, maybe you can communicate to us on whether or not that language is then going to be changed, as well as the other couple of points. I think we can still go ahead and consider the resolution of support, though.
Yeah, we can edit that to make it clearer. I think I might recommend just removing the point about the newer homes, even though later in the ordinance it does state that new homes aren't covered. But we will, yeah, we can rework that.
That would be great. So we have a resolution of support. Could you pull that up and display it? Do you have that handy, Zach?
Yeah, I can try to do here.
And maybe a parliamentarian can help me here. Councilmember Briggs, I'll finish my question. Since we already considered this ordinance of support back in February, do we need to reintroduce it with a motion to consider in a second, or can we just go directly into discussion? Maybe you can pose your question and answer my question at the same time. Councilmember Briggs.
Yeah, my question is related to, I just wanted some additional clarification around the exemption piece of things, which I understood what you're saying in terms of administratively, the goal would be to provide that as a service. But I'm a little concerned if folks, how that's been playing out in other communities, if that is an option, if it makes it a little bit quicker in terms of the speed of things, that folks might choose to just say, no, I'd rather go through the exemption process rather than even if you're going to pay for it. And so I'm just curious how that's played out. I assume that there's a desire not to commit ourselves in ordinance form, that we are paying for this in perpetuity. And so I understand the administrative component to that, but I'm just curious how this is, how this has worked in other communities.
Yeah, good question. I'm pulling up my notes here from interviews with like Hillsborough and Portland. And as I recall, neither have actually received very many exemption requests under this. They had similar language for low to moderate income households. And I think what they're finding is that they're, let's see here, is that they just haven't been receiving a lot of requests for that, but that doesn't answer your question. I can do a little bit of digging, Councilmember Briggs, if that's okay, and I can help answer that question.
Yeah, that's fine. It's not pressing for tonight. I mean, I'm assuming we really don't want to include it within the language of the ordinance that we would be paying for it, but just checking.
Makes sense. Councilmember Radina.
Thanks. I think I can answer your question, and then I do have one more question too. I think if this resolution is new, even if we looked at the ordinance before, I think the resolution needs to be moved and supported. And my question to Zach, sorry, I thought of one more. Is there a reason why I believe that this requires the assessment to be done at this time of listing as opposed to the point of sale, like a lot of other assessments? Is there a reason we did that specifically?
Yeah, you're seeing language in the ordinance requesting time of listing.
Well, yeah, you mentioned like you wanted in the MLS listing as opposed to it being something that's done before closing. Where I know, when I went through my home buying process, a lot of those the assessments that would take place, or most of those will happen after kind of an agreement's in place, and then they have to be completed by the time of sale, by closing.
Yeah. I'll harken back to the beginning of my presentation that stated one of the stated goals of this program is to sort of help drive that market of energy efficiency. And so by encouraging it at the time of listing, it gives prospective buyers the information so that they can make that in their decision making before getting to the point of agreement or locked in to the home. I will state that as written, the ordinance will focus more on time of sale. That was a recommendation by some of the preliminary legal review that we've gotten, because I think that the likelihood of being challenged increases as we get closer to time of listing. And so that's again where a lot of the administrative outreach and engagement falls on the OSI, is that as homes are getting listed, making sure that we are informing real estate agents and home sellers early on in the process that this is something that they're ultimately going to need to comply with anyway, and give them resources and information about how it behooves everyone to get it done as early as possible, to make that information available to as many people as possible, because it's required at the end of the day anyway.
I think I'm confused a little bit, and I'm also still confused by the title. Zach, I see you changed some of this in the title. So it now reads the Ann Arbor Code of Ordinances, but it still says time of sale. So when is this being conducted or required?
So again, it would be required by the ordinance by the time of sale. That removes certain requirements. Let's see. Doing it at time of listing involves a different process that real estate agents already must adhere to, and interfering with that process, I think, makes it more challenging for this to hold water, is my understanding. And so the requirement is at time of sale, but we would encourage it at the time of listing. And so that's when the OSI would be encouraging it through letters and through outreach to everyone who is involved.
So that frankly is a big concern of mine. When we talked, so as Zach knows, but many of you may not know, Carlene and I think Bridget and Wayne Appleyard, former chair, we held interviews with a number of different municipalities, Portland, Austin, at least those two for sure. And it's my understanding, Zach, that those are time of marketing requirements, at both of those municipalities. Is that correct?
I believe that Portland is actually set up the same way, where it's time of sale, but it is encouraged ahead of time.
So one of the reasons why, again, the group that originally drafted a version of this that was handed off to OSI, was that by doing it time of marketing, you actually touch two parties. You touch the seller and you touch the buyer. At the time of sale, then really you're not touching as much the buyer. Okay, there may be outreach and things like that, but if you're really doing this at time of marketing, you're encouraging the seller to look at this and to just simply comprehend it and think about what they're doing with their next purchase. And if you do it at the time of sale, it's really directed at just the buyer. And the other thing is that if you're really looking at disclosure, it's just like buying a car. You look at the sticker and there it is in big numbers, your MPG values, and you see that before you make a decision. It's not that you make the decision to buy the car, you go in the salesman office, and then as you're signing the contract, then they say, oh, by the way, this vehicle gets 12 miles a gallon, and this is how it stacks up against other vehicles. So I'm really concerned that this is leaving open a loop where we're just doing it potentially at the time of sale. But yeah, Commissioner Peck.
I couldn't agree more. I mean, this seems like a waste of time to do it at time of sale. That's all I can say. I mean, it's like really half-hearted. And if we want to have any impact on things, we got to do it at time of market. And logically, I bought enough houses through the time I moved around that could be done as part of inspection. Could be done, when you're also having to do a whole bunch of other disclosures. Time of sale makes no sense. And I think it's just a way to get the realtors to give in.
Exactly. So we're sort of getting into the consideration of the language. What I'm going to ask is for a motion to consider the resolution and a second. And then we'll dive into this. I was guilty of partly getting ahead of the game here. So can I have a motion to consider the resolution? I think I saw Carlene's hand go up. Is that correct? Yes. Okay. And a second from Commissioner Harp. So I'd like to open things up for comments. Any comments? No discussion. Okay. So Councilmember Briggs.
Yes, just to continue the conversation that the question was just raised. Zach, I don't know to the degree that, do you think there's an opportunity to move this to time of listing, or do you think there are there significant barriers, beyond sort of political considerations, but barriers to doing that?
Yeah, one of the barriers that we encountered when we were having some conversations with legal are enforcement barriers. Once it comes time to sale, because there's so many checks in place for what can happen before a house is closed on, that is a more natural setting, evidently, for doing checks like this. And it's much harder to do that at the other end of the time scale. So that's,
can I challenge that? I mean, you have the MLS. Is it in the MLS or is it not in the MLS?
Well, the requirement of the ordinance would be that it would have to be listed in the MLS.
So there you go. There's a check.
And I think the question at that point then comes down to, again, back to enforcement. That requires a lot of resources to check that those are getting into place. We do have some staff and budget time allotted for ensuring a quality check on that. But it falls down really to at the very end. That's when everything is looked at, and we were advised to include it at that time.
You know, you would, can I say?
Go ahead.
I think you would, sorry. I think you would be forcing, I'm not a lawyer, but I have a funny feeling you'd be forcing people to do it if you had a city requirement. And then if someone didn't do it and the seller wanted to get out of the deal, it would like be a piece of cake. And therefore, it would put a lot of pressure on both the realtor and the seller to comply, because they realize that there's like by not complying and breaking a city ordinance, you know, you'd be perfectly legal. I mean, I can't imagine you'd lose in court if you just decided not to buy the place. And people hate that. You know, you could bail at any time.
As the home buyer, you're saying?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think the realtor and the seller would, I mean, that would be doing them a great disservice. It's just creating chaos.
I agree. I do think that time of marketing is, for our goals, a far more effective approach. These were recommendations that were made to us by legal, who are looking at, they reference certain state laws that are in place that it would be far more difficult to enforce at time of listing. So
how about this? How about time of you know, like the normal way you do it, you put it in the contract. But I'm trying to think. You know, again, I'm not a real estate lawyer. I think we need to go back to the drawing board here, because there ought to be a way. You know, when you buy a house, you have in the contract, I need an inspection. I need to see, you know, all the, you know, liens. I need to see
disclosures, all those kinds of things.
Disclosures, this and that. That's when you want to have it in there.
Mm-hmm.
I would love it if it was before then. But by putting it at that stage, at least what you're doing is you're giving the buyer, potential buyer, an out. You know, because so you do an inspection and you find something you don't like, you ask the home buyer to fix it, or you get your money back, your deposit back. And this would fall in that same category. I'm really surprised the legal didn't go for that. I mean, did you, you know how, I mean, no offense if anyone's a lawyer, but you know, lawyers like to have things kind of ironclad. I understand that, but you know, we have a climate crisis on our hands and we got to get this done. We don't want to just have sort of a hollow regulation here.
I'm going to jump in just really quickly and just say, so I think as a policy body, I think we can advise one way or the other. I would discourage us from having maybe further conversation about the nature of the legal advice that staff is getting in a public meeting, just because if we were to go in one way or the other, we don't want to broadcast potentially what our lawyers are thinking about. And so I'm going to maybe save Zach a little bit from having to answer about what maybe he's hearing from the lawyers. But I think we can maybe express our preference one way or the other and then continue that conversation.
I apologize. Yeah, I think you're right.
No, I support that too. Other comments? Commissioner McComber.
So now I'm confused. So this is time of sale. Is it happening like at closing, or is it happening like somebody makes an offer on a house and this audit is done and they get the results, like a house inspection?
Sure. So certainly the latter is preferred. I appreciate the encouragement to maybe let me know what you're thinking, and we can go back and get a little more information on it. It's important to consider that a lot of this is coming from like an approach to it's more than just carbon reductions, and so it does get tricky because there aren't carbon reductions laws necessarily on the place or on the books. So it currently, as drafted, it requires it at time of sale. If we're doing our outreach appropriately, we're letting sellers know before it gets to that time that, hey, this is a new requirement and you are going to have to get this. And you should do it sooner rather than later, and then provide them with the resources to be able to do it.
So so is this something, I'm still confused. I didn't think I was confused, but I'm confused now. So is this something where you make an offer on a house and all of that stuff happens, you agree to the deal, you go to a closing, and you're handed this audit? Or is this something where you make an offer on a house, whoever, I guess the seller has to schedule the energy audit, and it's information provided to the potential buyer before the closing happens? So that they have the opportunity to react to it.
Yes, that's when we would like to see it.
So there's, if I may, and correct me if I'm wrong, there's a must and a want. The must is that it's available at closing. And when you get your stack of paper like this to sign, there's a piece of paper in there that has your home energy disclosure and your home energy score. The want is that it's available early on in the process so that when a potential buyer interacts with the seller, that information is available and that there's a dialogue at that time between the three parties, let's put it this way, the agents and the buyer and the seller about that. That is only a want. That is not a must. Is that correct, Zach?
I am going to have to ask for your forgiveness. A lot of these conversations happened 11 plus months ago. I am going to need to dig back through the advice that we were given from legal and identify where specifically they think that this would be most effective.
Councilmember Briggs.
Yeah, this is, I think, a confusing conversation, but I would say that in terms of what we're looking at on our agenda right now, it says that, as the ordinance is currently written, it says that prior to public listing any covered building for sale, the seller of the covered building or the seller's designated representative shall, and there's a variety of different things, but the last one is include the home energy performance score in all real estate listings, including the home energy performance report and attachments, if the attachments are accepted by the lifting service. So currently, as written, what we have is that there would be a violation if it wasn't done at the time of listing. So whether or not that's how the conversation has evolved over time, and is maybe an important point to check, as it sounds like there's been a number of conversations with OSI about this issue, but the ordinance that we're being asked to approve tonight, there would be a violation if that was not done. If I'm reading this correctly, is that correct?
Thank you for that. Actually, you remind me, I read it this afternoon. That was my understanding as well. And the point of confusion is that the title of the resolution still says at time of sale.
Correct.
Commissioner McComber.
So, which is it? Because
the ordinance says one thing and the resolution says something else. The ordinance says at time of marketing, essentially. That's what Commissioner Briggs just read. She quoted from the ordinance.
Sure.
If I'm not mistaken.
I'm hearing a contradiction.
It is.
And I'm not sure what we're voting on. Are we voting to let the legal department decide whatever they want?
Let's not vote. Let's have, Zach said he could go back and just clarify everything, get it all straight. And because I think what you're working on here is a really great idea. And we just want to make sure it's at time of marketing.
Commissioner or Councilmember Briggs.
To Councilmember Redina's point, because just to save staff time, in terms of the conversation that I've heard around the virtual table tonight, it sounds like there's a strong desire for this to happen at time of listing. That is what the ordinance in front of us says. If there's comfort with approving the ordinance language as is right now, this is an advisory body. We take that forward. And obviously there may be elements that need to be worked out before this comes to the council table. I would say that as council members, we would understand what the recommendation is here. If there's a different desire at the council, at this table, to not have it at time of listing and to have it at time of sale, then I would think that might be an amendment that might be proposed, or maybe we do need to postpone it. But what I've heard is that the comfort is actually around what the ordinance language says, not the title.
And I am inclined to agree with that. I think, again, forgive me, but Chairman Mirsky, the title that because you had pointed out some of that earlier today, I think that didn't get changed. And
Can we change the title and vote on it, and where it says at time of listing, and then that can be clarified and we don't lose time between this group and because that corresponds with the language in the ordinance that is in Legistar and attached to the agenda. So when we do these kinds of things, we change the wording often in the text in front of us. There's two other changes that I sent you that I recommended be changed anyhow. There we go, time of listing. And I made two other minor points. They're really insignificant, but maybe you've taken those into account. Yes, okay, great. Second whereas point has been changed. 21% of local emissions from the residential market. And then there was one other minor one. Yep, exactly. Yep, thank you. So with the change in the title, with the understanding that this is all going to be clarified, with the hope that we do not delay this any further. And I'm apologizing for what I'm going to say at a time, but this has been extremely frustrating to me and to others. There was virtually a complete version of this 3 years ago, and we considered this in February. And now here it is in October. And we are just too slow on some of these things. And somebody may have reasons. To me, they're not good enough. So I would like to dispatch with this. That's my position before I take the vote. I don't know if anybody else has anything to say before we take a vote in terms of registering their sensibilities. I'm willing to entertain those. Otherwise, we'll take a vote. Anybody else have any other comments? So seeing none, all those in favor of approving this resolution of support for the ordinance that we just had presented, please raise your hand and say aye. Aye.
Aye.
All those opposed?
Aye.
Any abstentions? Did I see an opposition from someone, or was just a hand that stayed up longer? No opposition. Okay, passes unanimously. Great. Councilmember Riggs.
Based on the discussion tonight, I feel like there's a strong sentiment a certain way. I just wanted to make sure that if we get feedback between now and when it comes to council that time of listing is not the appropriate route for one reason or another. Well, I guess for legal reasons would be the there could be other reasons, I suppose, as well. But is this something that you would like to have brought back? Do you think that's a big enough change to this ordinance that it should not move forward to the council table? I've heard some sentiments here that, time of sale is not okay, but I just want to make sure that there is also support with us moving forward if for some reason that shifts.
Go ahead, Councilmember McComber, how do you all feel?
So if it's time of sale, I mean, this is going to be a lot of work and staff time and resources on the part of a whole lot of people. And it seems as though if it becomes time of sale, it will no longer achieve what we want it to. And looking at the heavy lift that it's going to be to roll out and enforce, I guess my answer to that question would be, I think it's worth taking another look at it if it's really what we want to spend our resources, collective resources in.
Councilmember Radina, and then I think Commissioner McKenna had something as well. Go ahead, Councilmember Radina.
Thanks. I can maybe wait for Commissioner McKenna. I know she had her hand up. I want to make sure that that's the sentiment of the body, because I also did hear, Chair Mirsky, you acknowledge that this has taken a long period of time. And so if the desire is for this to come back to this body, if for whatever reason point of marketing is not achievable, that will add time to the process. And so I just want to acknowledge that as well. And so I guess I just want to make sure that that is the sentiment of the body, is that we would come back if a considerable change needs to be made.
Commissioner McKenna and then Commissioner Hart.
Thanks. I'd like to comment on just put a voice to what we think is a considerable change. I mean, I may be wrong when I'm looking at this like point of sale. I mean, just from what I know from other cities doing this, it's commonly called point of sale. And to me, that's a longer time frame than, the time that the buyer signs the paper. We're not talking about like a 30-second moment at time of sale where the buyer signs the paper. That's just kind of my take on it, that I think that time of sale is a common language that's used across the industry and policy for this. And so I just wanted to share that.
Commissioner Hart.
My thought on this is, I think the information that's being generated by this is useful at any stage in the process, both I think upstream in marketing, but also even after the sale. And I think the presence of that information, given how sort of durable it might be, and that its expiration is about 8 years, and the calculations themselves of the footprint, I think, are about 2 years or so, can be useful at multiple times. And so do we think it does better work in helping people make better decisions at different phases in the process? Yes, possibly. But I think also having the information at any point in the process will help further the goals that we're looking at.
So any other commissioners have anything to add to that? I mean, we've already voted unanimously in support of the resolution. Officially, that means it moves on. I would ask Zach that in any case, you reply to the entire commission as to what the situation is, both in terms of the proper interpretation, taking into account Commissioner McKenna's statement about what is common language and what does that really mean. So what does the ordinance itself really say and mean versus what sort of typical nomenclature around these things, and that is maybe more broadly interpreted. And that I would also appreciate information as to what the practice and experience is in other cities. And that will go to our 2 council members. That allows all of us to weigh in with those council members. We can weigh in with them, and they can then also present this when it comes to the entire council. So that way we don't slow things down. So I think we can do both. We still have an opportunity to weigh in on this with the information from Zach, if this moves forward. Does that sound acceptable to everyone? Great, good. So we are on to the next point on the agenda, which is an update from OSI and news from commissioners. Joe, I think you're going to take the lead here.
Yep. Pretty much as always, got a flurry of things, so trying to organize it by category here. But first, want to just go through some of the events that we've had recently and are upcoming. Last Friday, we had our Green Fair, talking about all the things we got going on. We had really, really good turnout and really good engagement with that. So a lot of people asking good questions and just having a good time all around. We also on Sunday had our first Ambassadors Summit, where we got together a bunch of the ambassadors who were coming together just to talk about what they've been doing, how the process has been, how it's changed what they've been doing going forward. So I got a lot of good impact or information from that. Solarize is ongoing. In fact, there's a meeting would have been earlier tonight at this point, so additional rounds of that are upcoming. And lastly, for upcoming, we have a local food festival this Thursday, learning about all the different food sources that are around. Got some vendors, got some a couple of the restaurants who are doing stuff with that. So if you've got time or have people that will be interested, send them that way. To go for a bit of fundraising, today we submitted a grant that we talked about, I think, at a previous meeting for the geothermal system in and around the Bryant neighborhood. This would be that 2-stage grant where the first stage is looking just at the design and a study or feasibility of what could possibly happen. And then based on that, DOE would down select to fund people that had a good design and something that would be feasible. And in really good fundraising news, one of the grants that we talked about previously ended up being successful. So the Community Action Network working in Bryant has received a $500,000 grant from MISHDA to get started on doing some of those home retrofits. We've kind of been stuck in this planning stage for a while with lack of funding, but now with this funding is kind of the first one in the line to get things done. We have to do some of the things to submit a final revised budget and finalize things with MISHDA, but we're estimating we'll be able to do around 20 home upgrades in Bryant with this funding, and hopefully that'll spur further funding as we have a proof of concept there. Wanted to talk specifically about where we are with some of the energy concierge stuff, as I know we've had some questions here and there and interest in the project. We've gotten started officially on the one-on-one version of this, which would be, people call in, they work directly with an advisor, looks at their home and starts making recommendations. We started working with Elevate and EgoWorks to make a model. It's kind of if you want to look up what a similar one is, it's called I Heart My Homes Connecticut. So this kicked off just in September. Julie Roth is working with these 2 partners to make sure it's in line with everything that we want here in Ann Arbor. The goal for it is to by late spring, early summer, to have kind of gone through a pilot process of working with around 10 to 20 buildings of a couple various different sizes and owner groups, just to see how it works with that. That hasn't yet started. We're still doing the back end, looking at how the modeling would work, figuring out the intake and everything that goes into that. And then once that's ready, we'll start doing outreach and working with some buildings in the community. We also have RMI will be helping out a little bit with that, doing some of the outreach and other information gathering. to talk about the virtual aspect of it, the website version. We've had a couple conversations with a couple different platforms of kind of what they offer, how it could be used, how it would apply to Ann Arbor, and also spoken to a couple other cities that have used some of those tools to see what they thought of it. We're also working with IT as we're going through some transitions with the website itself. They're working to upgrade and transition over the city website to a fully new platform that'll have a lot more information and capability. So they want to just make sure to first see what it would look like if it was fully hosted, on a city website versus everything else. So we're just kind of in discussions with them to see how that would all work. We should have more clarification on what we can expect from that, and then can inform our decisions going forward by hopefully the end of this year, if not early next year. And then lastly, just to give an update on staffing, as we talked about last time, we've been down a couple of people. We've currently made an offer for the administrative assistant position, and then we are in the process of interviewing for the engagement specialist position. We have not yet posted the community energy manager one, but that is in the works as well.
Thank you. News from commissioners and from council members. I'll take those as they come, not necessarily in that order. Any updates of interest? Okay. Seeing none, I would just mention one thing, and that is make sure that you and your friends and your family and everybody else votes on November 8th. And there is an important climate millage on the ballot, as well as a whole host of other candidates that will make a big difference on energy and climate. So make sure voting has consequences, as we have seen, unfortunately. Working group updates. I don't know if there's anything to report. Anybody have a working group update? No. Okay. So we move to public input. This is our second opportunity for persons from the community to speak for up to 3 minutes. If you're watching CTN, please call 888-788-0099 or 877-853-5247 and enter meeting ID 956-8718-7876. This information is also on the agenda and the video feed. City staff will select callers that have raised their hand one by one using the last 3 digits of your phone. In order to raise your hand, press *9 on your phone and you will hear an automated message that the host is allowing you to speak. When speaking, move to a quiet place and state your name and address at the beginning of your comments. We'll wait 30 seconds or so. Anything, Joe?
Nothing yet, no.
Nothing yet. Okay, well, let's go ahead and move on to agenda items for the next meeting. And if somebody calls in, then we'll stop and take that. So I want to just read off real quickly what I had written down. First of all, we're talking about a joint meeting with the Planning Commission that potentially could happen at our next meeting. I actually talked very briefly with Shannon Gibrando, who's the chair of the Planning Commission. They meet also on Tuesday nights at 7 o'clock. So there's a possibility of a joint meeting coming up. I wrote down a couple of other things that came up during the discussion. One is a presentation by Greg Keolian about, I guess, the general topic of purchased goods and what scope 3 emissions related to that. Is that correct, Commissioner Peck? You're still muted.
Yes.
Okay, good.
I mean, I got to talk to him and see how far
Yeah,
he's done, but I think he's had quite a bit of time to work on it, so I bet he's done a bunch.
Yeah, so if that's something you could circle back with me and with Missy, and then we could put that on the list. Then the other thing is potentially something related to fugitive emissions. I understood that that might be something that might be interested for this group. That's basically natural gas leakage. And if anybody knows somebody who might be able to speak to that, okay, Commissioner Peck, then we'll circle back with you. And a couple of other things that have come up outside the meeting. One of the things came up in the meeting is DTE data sources that I wrote down, and maybe we can get DTE to come in here and talk about how we can get them to accelerate providing data to us so that we're not looking in the rearview mirror. And that should be important to, I think, everybody, including themselves. And then another aspect of having DTE in here, some of you may have heard from your neighbors or others that DTE is now offering My Green Power 100% renewable energy at the same rate as what you currently pay. And it's not really clear, at least from what I've heard, as to what the details of that are. And I think that would be very interesting to understand that, and then how that compares to other offerings. I mentioned earlier, Arcadia also offers essentially a program for RECs. And then there's also, this would enter into, frankly, I think the considerations related to putting landfill on the solar, solar landfill on the solar on the landfill, and other potential things that the city may do, also related to the sustainable energy utility. I see Larry raising his hand.
Yeah, I also got something from DTE about greening of the gas supply that I thought I would like to know more about it as well. They claim to be green and how they're taking care of the forests at the same time. I've heard other people say that they're confused by it, don't know whether it's legitimate, true or not. And I think that's another thing that would be interesting.
That's a great point. Thank you. I had two other notes, and then I'll open it up for other comments too. One is our next meeting is on election day, and I know at least one person that's going to have an issue with that. I don't know that we've ever had that in the past, or if that's a concern. Is that a concern to any of the other commissioners? Is that problematic? Seeing a few nodding heads. Commissioner Briggs or Councilmember Briggs, did I see you nod your head? Yes.
I did. I think it's just generally problematic in the sense that we want to reduce any barriers there are to voting. And that means not encouraging folks to attend our meeting that night, both as commissioner or as a member of the public.
Right. Okay. So I will take that up with, go ahead. And I see a thumbs up on that. And I think another nod from Councilmember Adina, and I feel the same way. So I will take that up with Missy. I realize that shifting this potentially is problematic too, but maybe we move it to another Tuesday. But if we do something with the Planning Commission, I assume they would have the same objective that we would in terms of encouraging election participation. So maybe that's a good fit. And then the last note that I had with regards to this is in-person meetings. Can someone either from staff or council give us an insight into if and when we might return to in-person meetings? I know council and planning commission are both in person. Go ahead, Councilmember Adina.
Yeah, thanks. So we recently updated some of our COVID safety protocol for council meetings themselves. And at the last meeting, rescinded the state of emergency that the local state of emergency we were operating under. That being said, we kept in place the resolution related to council or to the commissions, which still, the original language says that other than the list of exceptions, all other commissions shall meet virtually or electronically. And so I don't believe that there's currently any exception for this body to begin meeting in person yet.
Okay, great. I appreciate the information for all of us. So for the time being, we remain then as is, and we can all plan accordingly. Did anyone else have any other ideas, suggestions for future topics? Commissioner Hart.
Yeah, it's somewhat with respect to the question of real-time emissions data, you know, and related to sort of the inherent variability of the grid and the fuel sources that are on that, and sort of how we can shift it. I was wondering if there might be folks that we might be able to bring in to help sort of talk about some of that. I have one or two in mind who might be able to speak to some of that from a presentation I saw recently with another organization.
Maybe you can feed me some information on that, or that may be at least a lead to maybe what we need to get to. Commissioner McKenna. Great, thanks.
Yeah, thanks. We have some colleagues at SEAS, researchers that specialize in marginal emissions and the grid. Like Michael Craig comes to mind. So definitely would be a great local resource.
Claire, if you could send me that, then we can also talk about that. Carlene, Missy, and I have a meeting where we talk about future agenda items and scheduling and who those would be and so on and so forth, because we have to also coordinate dates, obviously, with their calendar as well. So that's great. Any other comments? Okay. So this is not quite as long as some of the meetings we had last year when we were considering the feasibility study, but it was a long one, but it was also a very interesting one. And I really appreciate, again, working with all of you. I really appreciate the new commissioners. And with regards to the new commissioners, we typically have new commissioner orientation, and we have a number of you. So I will reach out with you. I made myself a note, and we'll send out a meeting poll and try to get all of us together and just talk about how the commission works and answer your questions, some expectations, things like that. So you'll hear from me here in the next couple of days or week or so. With that said, thanks again, everyone. And it is 8:54, and I declare this meeting adjourned. Have a great rest of your evening and a good night's sleep. Good night.
Thank you.